Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to continue right on with our discussion in Asian history and the development of civilization and cultures and states in Asia, East Asia to be exact. And for this lecture we're actually going to zero in on Southeast Asia. Now, before we begin our lecture proper for today, I just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in our last lecture, we looked at the spread of farming in Eastern Asia. We saw that rice, in particular, became a staple crop, a key crop in East Asia, and it remains a very key crop in East Asia. We also looked at northern China, and we observed the differences again, the environmental differences of northern and southern China, and how they also came into impact the choice of preferred staple crop. In southern China, it's wetter, it's more humid, so they gravitated, I should say, towards rice cultivation because it was it can be more easily cultivated there. In northern China, it's cooler, it's drier, so they gravitated towards millet cultivation. We examined the spread of agriculture into Polynesia. Those islands are biologically impoverished, as we stated earlier. Human settlement, sustained human settlement, was dependent, I should say, upon the introduction of stable, easily transferable food crops like tubular vegetables such as taro and yams, and they remain staple crops in those islands. Also, small animals, chickens in particular, were imported to those islands to facilitate human settlement. But then also that the Polynesians themselves, they develop a very rich aquaculture or fishing tradition of harnessing the marine resources of their islands. They became experts at netting, harpooning, the fishes and the other marine life in their along their in the reefs, in the coral reefs of their islands. And now, with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture today. And the lecture topic again is going to be the rise or the development of states, of territorial states in Southeast Asia. And before we even get to that, we again have to touch on rice. I cannot underscore just how important rice cultivation was to Southeast Asia and really just to East Asian society in general. Rice is the principal crop of Southeast Asia. Rice is really cultivated along the three major river networks of Southeast Asia. These rivers serve as the fertile enclaves, which flooded they regularly flooded on their floodplains each year with this shallow water where long stalk, fast maturing rice could be grown. Now, the three rivers are the Irrawaddy, the Chao Phraya, and I mean the Chao Phraya Delta, the Mekong, and the Tonle Sap plains, and these rivers, they all nurtured complex societies for many centuries. This area is very fertile and it generated large food surpluses. The rivers also acted as major avenues of communication and terminuses for trade routes, bringing in goods and materials. Now, the rivers would serve as a link between Southeast Asia and the greater world. It would act as a conducive for the resources and materials of Southeast Asia and the other states that were all interconnected in this global trade network. Now, the archaeology of this area is little known. Many places, like many other places, particularly places like in Africa, it has been on the periphery of scholarship. And this trend is changing, and we are learning more and more about this region. And the research is being done at a great pace, and we're coming to understand the lessons that these cultures can teach us. Now, around 5000 BCE, rice was being cultivated in egalitarian societies. These societies were not self-sufficient. They needed outside resources, much the same way the settlements in Sumeria were not really self-sufficient. They needed outside resources to thrive and to survive. They traded for foodstuffs, they traded for foodstuffs and they traded for other materials. After around 2000 BCE, they began to use bronze. And at the same time, rice production began to increase. Now, after 600 BCE, iron technology arrived in Southeast Asia at a time of major cultural and social change. Now, we do not know where the iron working came from. We don't know from which influence it came from. Now, the widespread use of iron was a catalyst for change in this region. We find larger communities, many becoming important centers of production. Now, the rise of wild rice cultivation in wetlands is generally attributed to the rise of increased organization. Plows pulled by water buffaloes, and also double cropping appears in this region as well. These factors all lead to agricultural surpluses. They require organized labor beyond the potential of the average family unit. It seems that leadership of kinship groups rose, that these kin leaders assumed the responsibility of the larger population centers. They came to control the food surpluses and the agricultural production, and the overview or the oversight of the agricultural production. These surpluses supported artisans who crafted trade goods that were exchanged throughout regional networks. Now, the most complex of these societies developed along or in the river flood plains, where population grew rapidly while trade expanded. Now, there were a number of factors that supported this development. One, the soil was fertile. The soil there still is very fertile. Two, there was plenty of water so rice cultivation could flourish. And by the first millennium, an aristocratic class had developed in Southeast Asia. They were ruling. They were ruling over the populations of this area, using their connections, their relationship with their ancestors. They were ruling using spiritual relationships. Now, the regional networks, the regional trade networks fostered by the rivers, had become a part of a much larger exchange network in Asia. The trade linked this region with India. It linked them with the remote islands of Polynesia. Chinese ships during this period regularly visited Southeast Asia, some venturing on as far as India. Now, the low-lying coastal ports of Southeast Asia linked them as a sort of centerpiece in the trade between China to India, and from India to the distant Mediterranean world. Now, Ashoka and other Mauryan rulers were Buddhist, and they embraced overseas trade and overseas contact. Indian and Southeast Asian contact accelerated during this period. The trade helped to spread trade goods, of course, and of course helped to spread ideas. The peoples of Southeast Asia at this point became familiar with Brahmin and Buddhist concept of divine kingship. Now, divine kingship revolutionized social and political organization in Southeast Asia. A society developed that rested on the divine lord, who was at the center of the state, whose diplomatic and military abilities now became all important. These states were really successful or failures dependent on the ability of one man. This one great man, this divine king, became their keys to success. And all power was invested in this great king, the divine king's person. Now, the early states were known as mandalas or mandalas, which expanded and contracted based on their interactions with their neighbors, and also based on the qualities, both spiritual and political, of their divine king. The divine king, more than anything, defined the fate of his kingdom. A strong ruler had a wide arm, and his authority will be respected by his lesser neighbors, by the lesser lords of his kingdom. And we might call these lesser lords, we might call them martial lords, and these would be men who govern on the periphery of the territory of a great ruler of one of these mandalas. We can also see that these martial lords were kept in line by the prospect of military invasion if they rebelled or in other way disobeyed this divine king. Now, the reverse was also possible, as if a weak ruler was the divine king, then the martial lords and the people living on the periphery territory, they could simply set their own course. The periphery martial lords could go into business for themselves. They could rebel against the divine king, and they can go on and enhance their own positions at the expense of the weak rulers. Now, mandalas, they flourished in the Tonle Sap and Mekong area, and this was an area with a very high population. Now, the Chinese have records detailing a kingdom known as Funan, and again, we spoke of Funan earlier when we began our discourse on East Asian when we began our discourse on Asian. The development of Asian civilization in general, but just to touch on it again, the Chinese have detailed records, I should say, of Funan, and we still don't know if Funan ever really existed. Again, they were Chinese chroniclers were writing from a great territorial distance and also a great cultural distance. Now, we do know that the Chinese detailed that Funan was where gold and bronze and spices were to be found, and they were to be found in abundance. Now, Funan is also described as a transportation hub where boat trade was widely practiced. Now, each major settlement in this region was connected by canals, and they were fortified by great earthworks and moats. Now, the political situation was extremely volatile, and by the 6th century, political and economic power had shifted upstream to the Tonle Sap, and this area was known by the Chinese as Chen La. Now Tonle Sap, with its rich rice fields and superabundance of fish, was a perfect place to support dense populations. It served really to rise due to the fact that by this time Hinduism was well established, and the Hindu creator Shiva became a social mechanism for justifying divine kingship in the region. Everything depended on the individual, on this great king's ability. Earlier rulers were unable to cement together a large peace kingdom before 802. In 802, all of that changed when a dynamic Khmer monarch named Jayavarman II conquered his competitors, and he set up his new territories. He set up these new conquered territories as tributary states. Now, Jayavarman II merged the ancient cult of the ancestor with the worship of Shiva. He transformed the vision of the world. He also went out of his way to ensure his subjects worshipped him as a god. Now, Jayavarman also had the cultural or the central institutions of government to back up this worship of himself as a god king. He had the institutions, the social institutions, and the administration to ensure that he could present himself as a cult figure, as a god king cult figure. Now, Jayavarman II ruled for 45 years. The longevity of his rule and his abilities meant stability for his kingdom. He was the first ruler of 3 Khmer dynasties that presided over a volatile state that at its height And its height was between 900 and 1200. At its height, it was one of the more prosperous states in existence. Now, the Khmer king was the protector. His noblemen, his priests were the instruments of his political power. Noble families presided over a bureaucracy, and they were given patronage for supervising every aspect of Khmer life. The most important aspect of Khmer governance was the building of royal temples that were used to house the royal linga. And the royal linga is simply a phallic symbol that embodied the king's the king, this divine king's power. And this entire period initiated an extraordinary a phase of extraordinary investment by Jayavarman and his successors, who built massive shrines on mounds. And they built them at a place called Angkor. Now, Angkor was the hub of the Khmer universe. It was the home to and it is really home to some of the greatest archaeological sites that we have, not just for the Khmer's, the Khmer empire, or for Southeast Asia, but just in the world in general. This is home to some of the more greatest and more notable archaeological sites in the world. Now, Suryavarman II, he built the Temple of Angkor Wat, and he built it in 1117. Now, Angkor Wat is the largest religious building in the world. It dwarfs the largest ziggurat in Sumeria. It dwarfs the pyramids of the Giza Plateau, and it dwarfs the Parthenon. It also dwarfs Tikal, and the Great Pyramid of Tikal in Mesoamerica that were built by the Mayans. Now, every detail of the temple reproduced the heavens in a terrestrial mode. The highest tower represented the cosmic mountain Meru, where the gods lived. Now, the remaining four towers depicts Meru's lesser peaks. Now, a great enclosure depicts the mountains on the edge of the world, along with the surrounding moat. And the surrounding moat represent the ocean. Now, a model. Now, all of this serves to really just be a earthly or a terrestrial model of the cosmos, had defined by Khmer culture. Now, Angkor Wat also boasts a wall with impressive friezes of sensuous dancing girls, armies with war elephants advancing into battle, and really all of the glorification of Suryavarman II's reign. It emphasizes his reign, his kingdom, and his place in the cosmos. It is a masterpiece, but it was built at an enormous cost. Now, during his lifetime, Suryavarman II used the temple at Angkor Wat as a palace. When he died, his remains were buried in the central tower of Angkor Wat. And it was done so that his soul would make contact with his royal ancestors and enter the divine image. He became one with Vishnu after his death. Angkor Wat taxed the resources of the Khmer kingdom at a time when the Khmer were engaged in vicious strife with neighboring kingdoms. In 1181, Jayavarman VII, a Buddhist king, started building a new capital at Angkor Thom, which is nearby. And while Angkor Thom is not as striking as Angkor Wat, and it's mainly because Angkor Wat is a bit more spread out. Angkor Thom is a bit more contained. It's smaller. But Angkor Thom is surrounded by a large, dark, towering wall. It has large plazas where ceremony took place, and today Angkor Thom is partially overgrown, but at its height, it would have supported hundreds of thousands in its general vicinity. Now, Jayavarman VII dedicated the temple of Ta Prohm to his mother in the image of Buddha's mother. Now, all of this construction was designed to bolster the king's position, this divine king's position, much in the same way that we can look back and we can draw a comparison between the creation of the pyramids in Egypt and the promotion of the Egyptian Nisut's position as the divine ruler. All of this took place at roughly the height of the Khmer Empire. But between 1430, no, I should say in 1430, a Thai army invaded and it besieged Angkor from the west. The Thai army defeats the Khmer army, and it breaks and it decisively ends the Khmer kingdom. The Khmer kingdom dissolves rapidly after that. The great temples and the palaces, they become desolate. They're abandoned places, and they're left to be overgrown by the forest. There had been changes in the world as well. But by 1430, the same pattern that we can observe in the West, in which Islamic conquerors, Islamic merchants, in an effort to wage economic warfare, they shift trade routes away from non-Muslim economic centers. We see this with Axum in the Horn of Africa. We see it in the Nile River Valley with Cairo, a garrison town, having all of the trade routes diverted there. We see it with Baghdad. We see Babylon displaced by Baghdad because all of the trade routes are rerouted to Baghdad. The changes in the world was that by 1430, Islamic traders and Islamic trading networks had expanded, and they had finally made it to Southeast Asia. And they were unwilling to allow non-Muslims to participate in this trade. The Khmer, the trade ports that had existed for centuries, that had been linchpins, centerpieces in the global trade network that brought in goods from China, and exchanged them with goods coming in from India and goods coming in from the Mediterranean world. Those trade routes are moved, and they're moved to the port of Malacca. The Arab society, or well, not really the Arab, but the Islamic society that rises and develops, controls the trade routes, and they move the trade routes to the port of Malacca, which becomes the new chief economic center in a more regulated, interconnected trade network, and this is regulated under the auspices of Islamic leaders. The new religion, this new religion preached the message of religious egalitarianism, but in the face of centuries of divine rule, it was really just not feasible. And again, this is the Buddhism. This is the new Buddhism that had displaced the earlier Hindu influences. Buddhism moves in, and it preaches this new message of egalitarianism, and it does not mesh well with the concept of divine rule. In Southeast Asia, the king is no longer divine. The king is no longer the pinnacle of society. And this also sort of helps to further the splinter or the breakdown of Khmer civilization. So a number of factors: the loss of trade routes, new intellectual message, and of course military defeat. Now we'll break here, and when we come back, we will take We will take our look at China, and we'll conclude our look on East Asian civilizations up until this point. We will conclude with China before we head on to the Americas, and we have not had of yet really discussed the Americas, but we'll spend the remaining lectures for the first half of the World History presentation detailing the developments in the Americas. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I will see you guys next time.